What's up, everybody? Welcome to Send It, the official blockchain and cryptocurrency podcast by OKX Insights. I'm your host, Adam, and I will not be on camera today because, unfortunately, my boiler is broken, so it is what it is. And I'm joined, as always, by Hunain, my fellow senior editor here at OKX Insights. Hunain, how's it going today?
Hey, good. Everything's good. Happy to be here today.
What's your excuse for not being on camera?
Because nobody else is on camera. I don't want to be the odd one out. Everybody's going to be staring at me.
Yep. I'm just kidding. And we have two cool guests with us today. We have DC Builder, who is returning to the podcast, friend of the show. DC, how are you today?
Hello, I'm doing good. Happy to be here again.
Can you do a brief introduction of yourself for anyone who doesn't know?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a blockchain researcher at Morales, and I'm currently transitioning to being a blockchain developer. So yeah, I just post around on Twitter about tech and build cool things.
Very cool. And we are also joined for the first time on the show by Convex Degen. Convex, how's it going?
Pretty good, thank you. My JPEGs are pumping, so that's always good.
Yes, indeed. Can you also do a brief introduction of yourself for the audience?
Yeah, sure. I'm almost like a professional shit poster. I work at a Dino DeFi startup during the day, and then I like to just shit post and create the Twitter trade and build cool things when I have the time.
Right on. So, without further ado, the theme of this show is broadly like our predictions for 2022. For anyone listening at home, we had a year-end wrap-up in our last episode with Tim Copeland from The Block. So if you want, you can go check that out. But this one, we're looking forward. New year, new me, all that good stuff. So yeah, I'm just going to throw it right to DC Builder. What is one of your predictions for the cryptocurrency market for 2022? Can be anything, just throw something out there.
Well, there's many primitives that I'm excited about, but mostly is it's the famed L2 2022 sort of trend that it's emerging. It's a fun acronym for just saying L2s or layer 2s on Ethereum and 2022 as in this year. And so I think that finally we're going to have a year where block space is more available and where it's going to allow for more resource intensive applications. And so a lot of innovation where people and builders can leverage that new block space to create new primitives that weren't possible before. And it's just like the infrastructure is still kind of young, but the tools that are out there are getting better. The infrastructure is improving as well. And once you have more bandwidth and different changes are put in place, then I believe that it's going to be like a renaissance for innovation, because people are not going to be as worried about being resource constrained, especially builders. I don't know if you know, but there's many builders that are just like extremely focused on gas minimization. That's perfect, but it's still like there's many use cases that require more resources that have been put off blockchains, which could hop onto blockchain. So I'm interested in like experiments that use more bandwidth that are now possible thanks to L2s and other scaling technologies.
Yeah, and like you being a dev, obviously, like, can you also explain to the listeners a bit, like, maybe like a more general kind of definition of an L2, or how it makes like your average user's life better, and also what specific L2s do you think are well positioned for this year?
Mm-hmm. So an L2 is essentially a separate network that does execution off-chain. So it stores data off-chain and it does execution off-chain, but puts the results of these transactions into a bundle or a group, and that bundle then gets into a proving system. And that proving system generates a proof that those transactions or the state transitions in those transactions are valid. And once the proof is generated, it submits that into a smart contract on L1. And so the proof data or the proof call data is stored inside of the L1 smart contract. And so what it generally means that you can as a user, you can put your funds in an L2 and inherit the security of the underlying network on top of which you're building, in this case Ethereum. And so you can inherit the Ethereum security without having to compromise on scalability. And so you have a lot of scalability on this separate execution network, where you have usually one or a few sequencers. So it's just like two very, very powerful computers that can sequence transactions almost immediately and do a lot of them. And then you can bundle these transactions and create a cryptographic proof and submit that proof onto L1. And so examples of this, so what benefits do users get from this? Of course, it's cheaper gas. So you have more block space, and by that you also, since you can fit more transactions in the same block space on Ethereum L1, it means that you have lower costs, so lower transaction costs and higher speed. Also, you have lower latency for verification, not for finality. You still need that proof to be submitted to the L1 and achieve L1 consensus finality. But for what the user experience is like, the confirmations is almost instantaneous. So it's like a very low feedback time from the website. So you just click, for example, on Uniswap trade, you sell your assets, and it's like instant confirmations. That's sort of like the UX improvement. It's also good for example, games and all of that. So lower transaction fees and also more scalability, meaning that you can process a lot more transactions. Examples of L2s that are sort of good. There's two camps of L2 solutions. There's the ones that are based off of optimistic rollups and the ones that are based off of zkRollups. Optimistic rollups are more mature in the sense that the technology was already there for a couple of years, and now it's just a matter of rolling out the infrastructure and setting and improving on it. zkRollups were more in the development phase, or like in the conceptualization phase, like last year, where a lot of the key features that needed to be researched and developed in the academia space still needed to be put in place. And so now we already have that, and it's only a matter of building different virtual machine environments that support zk proofs at scale. And so there's many teams building on both of these camps, right? You have people in optimistic rollups like Arbitrum, Optimism, Boba, and Metis, and others. And then you have like the zk camp, where you have, for example, like Polygon Hermes or Starknet, zk Sync, and some others. I'm bullish on on almost all of them. Everyone is building a plethora of good solutions, and so what's going to determine which ones are more relevant is mostly due to adoption. And once they have tokens, which a few of them do, I think that that's going to drive a lot of activity on the network, and we're going to see a lot of new projects developing on them, or existing projects deploying on those networks, and also creating solutions which make it easy to interoperate between these networks and have, for example, like shared liquidity or cross L2 like smart contract relay messages, message relaying, and things like this. So that's sort of like my summary of L2s.
Do you think that those that don't have tokens will all have tokens in this year?
Yes, I think so. I think so for sure. There's many of them that already have this in the documentation. It's not like they're hiding it. For example, if you look at the zk Sync documentation, they mention a token in their documentation, so it's sort of like a given for many of these teams to have a token, and it's just better incentives. You cannot propagate a network without having a good incentive structure for it. If you look at what one of the main reasons why all of these old L1s have been thriving for the past for 2021 in general, it's because they had a token and because people could invest in these cheap block space networks like Binance Smart Chain in the beginning of the year, on Polygon POS as well, so Matic. Then you already had other like AVAX, the famous trio, so Solana, Avalanche, and Terra. and also, for example, Phantom. So all of these networks had tokens, right? And once they had tokens and their tokens had a lot of value or market cap, the team allocations were used to fund ecosystem development. And so you could fund developers to onboard onto the network and create DeFi protocols on top of it, or create incentives for people to build or learn the technology stack for it through like hackathons or and other events. So I think that in order to promote a network or like have a healthy incentive system for everyone in the that's playing inside of the network, I think it's almost a must to have a token. And this is like the general sentiment across the space. I think from what I've seen, like these people are thinking of making tokens, and they have investors, so they need to somehow give equity of that investment to those investors. So I believe that tokens are sort of inevitable, and we're going to see this happen this year. I think so.
What do you think about, you mentioned Solana and Terra and Avalanche. What do you think? I mean, they obviously had very impressive years in 2021. What do you think their outlook looks like in 2022? And this question can, I mean, feel free anybody to jump in, Convex or Hunain as well. But what do you guys think about these hot, popular alternative layer ones this year?
I think at least one of them will convert to be an Ethereum rollup, because those chains are really good at execution. They're not so decentralized, and they don't care about that now. But they have a huge opportunity to become a rollup and like embrace the future, as DCbuild3r said. I see that as like the only path viable for their future. If they continue to get user and get adoption, eventually like they'll hit arbitrary limits, and we've seen these a couple of times this year already. So I think we will see someone that does like a publicity stunt and pivots to being like an Ethereum rollup.
Yeah, I can comment on that. Anything like rollups are cool in the sense that you can have whatever custom execution environment you want, and just through using these cryptographic systems, you can bundle or put the execution system inside of a box and settle on Ethereum, right? So you could have whatever custom execution environment you want. You can have, for example, Solana's execution environment, and it's like Anchor, Rust environment for developers, and bundle it inside of a rollup and put it on Ethereum. But like there's sort of pros and cons to this. There are execution environments if in the other L1s. For example, if you have, for example, Avalanche, their most famous or most used chain is their C chain, which is an EVM sort of Geth fork. And so it's basically like an Ethereum network that uses the consensus of Avalanche to find its finality and security. So you could technically use them inside of a rollup, but they're not purpose built to execute using these cryptographic primitives. So it's like morphing something that's been built for a completely different reason into a rollup. So if they really want to become a rollup long term, they really need to change a lot of their infrastructure, do a complete like 180 on several different things. Well, what they do is they try to scale indefinitely at the base layer, that they scale consensus and execution at the same time, and that is very hard to do. It's one of the hardest problems in all of like blockchain engineering, and that's sort of like the consensus on the problem. The blockchain scalability trilemma is one of the, it's how it's defined, the problem. And so if we see these chains sort of pivoting towards a different narrative, it will take a lot of the resources, and they're not built for this. So it's possible for it to happen, but I don't really think that once they've like spent so much marketing on their own, or like they spend so much time and put a lot of effort into promoting these alternative solutions, that they will try to pivot. Because I've seen many of these teams actually bashing rollups on Ethereum. Like Avalanche is bashing because they have subnets and other things. Then you have Solana, Anatoly debating on Twitter about why rollups are a hacky solution, and that Solana scales better with concurrency and like, for example, like sharded execution and things like that. Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see the narrative moving forward, whether monolithic L1s, as they're categorized by people that are trying to build L2 ecosystems, call them. It's going to be interesting for sure, like how this dynamic plays out long term.
Do any of you guys think like or off the top of your head, do you have any L1s or L2s that like you think could sort of come out of nowhere in 2022 and get a lot of traction that people don't really know about yet? Like, for example, like I don't know, this isn't a prediction on my part, but like last year I got some pity allocation for like Casper or whatever. It's like I don't know anything about Casper, but it's like that's like there, just somewhere doing like whatever. I don't know. With your guys like insight, do you know of, maybe not, but do you know of like anything that you kind of are expecting maybe to just come out of nowhere, take people by surprise, or not really?
I have one. I'm not sure it's investable. I have not invested, and I don't know if you can actually invest in it. But it's called Fuel V2. It's by a co-founder of Celestia, John Adler, and it's supposed to be this optimistic rollup that uses the UTXO model, just like Bitcoin and Cardano. But it does so in a smart way, and that enables you to leverage all the cores of your CPU when validating blocks, which then means that it's supposed to be way more scalable than like an EVM rollup. And it's going to be hard for it to get adoption by developers because it's not EVM compatible. And the smart contracts have their own language and all that. But I do believe that you might see an application that like blows people's mind built on this thing, and it's not really possible anywhere else.
Yeah, you mentioned Celestia. So there's like a different flavor of blockchains that can emerge. They're called data availability layers. And so you have things like Polygon Veil and Celestia, which are building these solutions. Data availability layers are essentially networks which guarantee that the data is available through a technique that's called data sampling. Data sampling, in short, just means that it's a technique that's used to randomly sample the data inside of a node and guarantee that all of the state history is inside of that node. And so you can have a fair, you can assume that the data is there. And so that's sort of like a good way of providing data availability to for example, rollups or other scaling solutions. So that this is like a different flavor. It doesn't assume like the consensus of Ethereum or anything else. It's like a separate network, but it can be used, for example, to create a solution that's called a Validium. And Validiums are essentially networks which settle on these data availability layers. And so you could have less secure networks, but that they have a lot of throughput. And so you could have, for example, like game specific networks, which could settle on these layers and have less guarantees in terms of security, but they would be a lot very scalable. And there's even a hybrid solution, which is called evolution, where a user can choose on a per transaction basis whether he wants to settle on a Validium or on a zk rollup. So, for example, if you don't care, or what you could do is, for example, let's say that you're using DYDX and that they use evolution, right? So you're doing your perpetuals trading for the day, and you do all of that inside of a Validium. And at the end of the day, you could take that state transition and maybe commit it to Ethereum at the end of the day and generate a proof. So maybe like things like these are going to emerge as well, where you could have like different security trade-offs for more scalability and choose what you want for a specific use case. So that's sort of like a cool variant that not many people know about because it's sort of still being in development. One of these solutions, which is being built by Starkware, is Starkware is building a lot of infrastructure, but one of them is Immutable X, which is partnered with Immutable, is like an NFT platform where it's sort of long term, it will be a volition where everything is optimized for NFTs. So NFT transactions, minting, trades, like marketplaces, all of that are going to have a lot of throughput through these scalability solutions. And users can choose whether they want security or whether they want high performance or throughput. So it'll be cool, for example, to have OpenSea or SudoSwap or any platform on these solutions. So it'll be very cool to have a lot of scalability in the next few years, I think.
Cool. Maybe pivoting a bit away from L1s and L2s, or not, depending on what you've got lined up, Convex Degen. What's one of your predictions for this year?
I think we'll start to see a lot more DAO products. And what I mean by that is I think we'll start to see a lot more DeFi primitives that are aimed specifically at DAOs. And one of those could be covered calls that they sell on their treasury tokens. Because in general, I think that there's a lot of capital in DAOs that's really underutilized. A lot of DAOs sit on millions and millions of dollars of their own token, and they basically do nothing with it. They cannot sell it because that's bad optics. And so that they're just stuck with this bunch of tokens that do nothing. But DAOs need money, they lack money, and there might be demand for some of those tokens some way or another. If you structure it in a nice product that can give leverage to those who buy it and yield to those who sell it, which in this case will be the DAOs. I see like Ribbon program for DAOs to be really interesting. I think all of the curve wars are also very interesting because like they play on this idea that DAOs want to acquire resources and they'll use their own tokens to bribe people and to actually get them. Because like tokens are cheap to them, so they want to acquire more stuff with that.
Can you briefly can you talk a little bit about like the curve wars for like the listeners that might just maybe have heard about it but don't really know like what's going on?
Right. Yeah, I might not be the best person to do this, but I'll try my best. So the basic idea here is that Curve is a decentralized exchange that's optimized for things that almost look the same, for assets that are almost the same. And you can think of this like stable coins to stable coin swaps. Now, what Curve initially did is reward LPs with fees. And once it launched its own token, it then rewarded LPs with its token rewards. Curve has this whole mechanism, which is his governance, to allocate more CRV to certain pools. So the again, really basic idea without going into all the details is that if you control the governance of Curve, you can then control where the CRV is allocated between pools, which then means you can control where LPs will provide liquidity, which means you can like bootstrap your stable coin, or you can have more volume, more liquidity in your pool. So based on this idea, there is this huge like war to get more CRV and get more voting power because Curve is huge. And we have seen during the year a lot of players like Abracadabra redirecting liquidity to the meme pool. And we've also seen more sophisticated ways of like bribing governance holders, Curve governance holders, to redirect rewards towards certain pools. And you know the prince example of this is Convex, which is this protocol that tries to accumulate vote escrowed CRV to then redirect rewards and pays people that give their VCRV with additional Convex rewards.
That's like really interesting stuff, for real. On the subject of DAOs, what do you think? So last year we had like the whole Ohm fork sort of meta, to use the popular term going around now since Kobe's article, which I think is a brilliant term, anyways. But the sort of Ohm fork, do you think that's sort of done and gone? Do you think there will be sort of a micro resurgence of it? Because a lot of times I think when you see some of these trends, they come in waves, right? Like most things in the market, maybe. But I think about like airdrops in general, sort of have waves. I think back to when there was the Cope airdrop on Solana, and then that spurred on just like a wave of progressively less good Solana airdrops. And I think like that was the situation with Ohm forks. Like each Ohm fork got progressively sort of like worse. But I don't know, do you think any of these sort of existing Ohm forks will maybe gain more traction, or will they all just sort of kind of universally fade into irrelevance? What do you guys think about that, I guess, broadly?
I'm actually really excited to see more forks fade into irrelevance, because it gives us, it lets us see what will happen if Ohm failed. Like, we have all those different Ohm forks and they all have their different life cycle. So it gives us an idea of what might happen or how Ohm might fail. It's not necessarily true that it will fail, but those give us an idea. What I do think about Ohm and Ohm forks is that Ohm primitives are like nothing short of genius. They really like invented, I think, a new section on tokenomics books. And the thing I like the most about it is that the protocol kind of can value asset at a different rate than everyone else. Like the Ohm treasury can value one Ohm to be equal to one DAI, and that like enables them to do things like bonds, protocol owned liquidity, and all those things, which were really not possible before. And I think we will see this primitive being used in other protocols as well, by having a treasury or like an entity that does not care about one specific asset, or that values two assets in a specific way. And then that enables a lot of new primitives and allows people to get the tokens by providing a useful service for that treasury or for that contract. So really interesting to see. Like one of the more interesting examples I know of is like Senpai Swap. I'm not sure like if the experiment failed or not, but the idea there was that it was going to be a DAX that owned its own liquidity, that was going to use protocol-owned liquidity for its own pairs. And if you think about it, it's kind of really smart, because if you have a DAX that owns its own liquidity, then you don't really care about impermanent loss, because it's not people taking it, it's the protocol taking it. But the protocol might have like a different utility function than people that provide liquidity. Like they might just care about LP tokens. They don't care about what would have this portfolio performed in dollar terms. So I think this primitive is really, really powerful, and we'll see a lot of it.
I can actually comment on Senpai Swap, because it's created by one of my friends, or one of our friends at Waifus Anonymous. And so I was one of the early participants in Senpai Swap. And the problem with Senpai Swap as a sort of, if you can consider it failed, it's not really failed, it's still up and running. But the problem with it is that it launched on Boba, which was it is an optimistic rollup, which is a fork of optimism. And sort of the thing with L2s at the beginning, or especially ones that aren't mainstream, the two mainstream optimistic rollups are Optimism and Arbitrum. But Boba was sort of, it still has a decent amount of liquidity, but it certainly doesn't have a mature DeFi ecosystem. And so when you're trying to do a lot of bonds and liquidities with stable coins and incentivized tokens and holders on an L2, which doesn't have a mature DeFi ecosystem, once we saw this drawdown, or like second fall, we had this like drop in October, November, December, where we went back from all-time highs all the way to where we're here. And so when you're a new project on an L2, which doesn't have a mature ecosystem, and you're in a bear or sideways market, that's sort of like why it's hard to cope with all of those negative headwinds. And so that's sort of like what happened there. What they're doing now is that they're migrating to Avalanche. So there's currently a proposal going on to migrate the liquidity to Avalanche, but the protocol itself is migrating to Avalanche already. That was already voted through in governance. So it'll be interesting to see, for example, like what it would look like on a cheap environment where you have tons of liquidity, because on Avalanche you do have quite a bit of liquidity for from example from Abracadabra and some other Ohm forks, and then you have also like dexes there. But yeah, in terms of other Ohm forks that I find interesting, one of the most interesting ones that recently came to my attention was Butterfly or redacted cartel, which is essentially an Ohm fork that uses Curve for auctioning their bonds and things like that. So I still don't understand like the entire mechanism of how it works, but it's like a money Lego that builds on top of Curve and utilizes the Olympus bonding system. So that's sort of like a cool new primitive that I've found recently, and it's fairly big. It went from like 0 to 500 mil US in market capitalization in a fairly short amount of time. Yeah, so those are like two primitives that are interesting for sure.
Do you think we will see more DAOs spring up, similar to like Constitution DAO that got a lot of mainstream attention? Like these kind of DAOs that don't necessarily know how to define them, but I guess they just sort of like
DAOs.
Yeah. I mean, do you think we'll see more of those in 2022 that
Definitely.
maybe specifically, because I'm sure we will see more, but do you think we'll see more that that hit like mainstream headlines?
Yes, for sure. I already see this. Like there's at the end of last year, we had like three, like after Constitution DAO ended, and we didn't win. So you had, for example, like Blockbuster DAO, where people came together and they're trying to buy the Blockbuster IP. So like the last shop with everything that's inside of it. Then you also have, for example, like the Olive Gardens, where people were auctioning NFTs for different olive gardens throughout the world. And so, yeah, I see this for sure happening and becoming mainstream. These other tools weren't as mainstream as Constitution DAO, which became sort of very popular in the US specifically. It wasn't on every single major public like media outlet that I've seen, at least. And I think that these people, once they saw that it's possible, it's much easier to try to replicate it rather than being the first adopter or like the adventurer. And so what Constitution DAO did, even though it didn't succeed, it's setting a precedent for something that could be done in the future. And once people have something they care about, I think it's just a matter of time for them to set up a DAO and try to collect it and sort of give somehow either distributed governance over that thing or shared ownership, which is impossible to enforce. So it's basically what other people have done. There's also like interesting things, like for example the DAO that fractionalized the Doge NFT. Pleaser DAO, which bought the original Doge NFT. So things like this, I think they will emerge for sure, and people will try to own those things because they find it valuable, and like yeah, like this is a very interesting sort of narrative where people are gathering together and having shared resources or collecting resources together to collect or own different things. And there's even different variants to this. Like there's people that are trying to invest together as DAOs or sell together assets as DAOs. It's very interesting for sure. That's one of my predictions that I had in my list for today. So I think that that's definitely going to keep happening this year for sure.
Yeah, it almost looks like it's a new way of aggregating capital. Like there is this cool thing it will be really cool if we bought it, or like funny, or like it just sounds like a funny idea, something you immediately think it's valuable, and then it's really easy to aggregate capital for the first time, I think, in history. So we'll definitely see more of those, and I also believe they'll get more and more creative.
Yeah, they came up with like $42 million in like a week or something like that, something crazy, like $42 million in like a week and a half, something like that. It was insane.
Yeah, so this is really insightful stuff and very on trend. But I'm wondering for someone like me, for example, who kind of sticks to the classic chains and doesn't understand all of this on-trend stuff really, would you say that these classic chains, Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, even XRP, Doge, do you think they've kind of fallen out of the meta? Do you think there's something to look forward to when it comes to them in the new year? Or do you think that they're just going to kind of remain muted? And then we can also discuss where the market's going and how do you think they will react compared to these newer, more meta, let's say, protocols.
If you look at really old chains, they were mostly like task specific. I can think of like Golem or like Sia Coin or Filecoin. Let me think. Well, there's a bunch of storage ones, and then there's others that were mainly tasked with one thing. Or they try to solve the scalability issues in some way or another, like like Bitcoin Cash. What I think will happen is that either most of those die off, or they have to reinvent themselves to kind of live in this new paradigm of modular blockchains and all that. And I think that some of those that are like storage specific, I think there's an argument to be made that they could reinvent themselves, like put something on their roadmap to eventually become like data availability layers. So I wouldn't completely rule them off. I would be very bearish on something like an OG kind of chain, like maybe Litecoin would be kind of bearish on that. But I think that chain that are specific and have like a nice history or like had a good tech team, they have a chance. I wouldn't completely rule them off.
Yeah, I think with sort of like OG, like dinosaur coins, or some people might call them, I think they're in desperate need of a new narrative because at the start of this latest bull run, when institutions came in, and really entered the Bitcoin market in force, I think the narrative for something like Litecoin or a lot of these things was that they would also benefit from like institutional interest. Now, I'm under the impression that with like the grayscale trusts for a lot of these sort of like major altcoins and stuff, I'm under the impression they're not particularly popular. And I think that most serious kind of like institutional investors or big money or however you want to classify it, I think they skipped right over them and went pretty much straight into DeFi. Like looking at, like sort of following what Mark Cuban was doing and a lot of these guys, like they started to look at, like they just jumped right over that whole like dinosaur coin OG market. That's sort of how I interpret it, at least. So I think you're right, Convex. Like they need to like reinvent themselves in some way. I mean, of course, there's always these huge kind of, for lack of a better term, like bag holder communities of stuff like Nano or whatever. But it's like I don't know what they do or where they fit in the current market dynamic. Like I don't know what problem they solve, because the problems that they tried to solve are very like 3 years ago, let's say. But 3 years ago in this industry is like 3 decades ago, essentially.
Yeah, and kind of I also want to ask another thing. Like, for example, Adam just mentioned this new market dynamic, and Convex Degen said this new paradigm. If you were to explain this new paradigm, this new market dynamic in let's say a couple of sentences, what would you say is the core of, at the core of this? Like, what defines this new paradigm? If somebody was to try and understand what this new meta, what this new paradigm means, where do you think it's like the core of it? What is that?
Okay, I'll try my best to sum it up. Let's start from the meta of the past year, which I think was block space is valuable. We want cheap block space. We want chains that are fast, and most people cannot afford mainnet Ethereum or a rollup, because the rollup tended to get expensive at times as well. So then you have all those chains that promise to solve scalability issues, and they promise to scale indefinitely and all that. We've seen some limitation on those chains this year, and the new meta of like modular blockchains, what that basically says is there is no way of scaling a blockchain to like millions of transactions per second on a single layer. You need to have chains that are specific to doing only one thing, so they can do only that and do it really well. So then in this new meta, you have rollups, which are basically chains that only do execution. They don't do consensus, nor they do storage. And then you have things like Celestia, which only do storage and data availability. And you also come back to this kind of idea of like the relay chains, like for example, like Polkadot has this relay chain, which was supposed to be like a really strong chain with really strong consensus where your parachain could anchor to, and so inherit that security. So you have chains that are good for security, chains that are good for storage, and chains that are good for execution. In this new meta, if you're like a Dino coin, you kind of need to see what was your previous narrative, I think, and try to fit in this new meta in like one of those three boxes. Like maybe you're like, if you think about it, like rollups use Ethereum today because they inherit the security of Ethereum. But if rollups were technically possible on Bitcoin, then you could argue that it would be better to have a rollup on Bitcoin rather than a rollup on Ethereum, because you could say Bitcoin is more secure than Ethereum. Not saying it's possible, but you could have this sort of narrative come up. And I think those kind of Dino coins, they need to somehow fit in this kind of narrative, or they need to show that they have really cheap block space and they work really well. But then you also kind of need EVM compatibility, because we learned that we like to build apps when there is the EVM available. So it's definitely hard for some of those and might not be possible for all of them. But the ones that are left definitely need to pivot into one of those three buckets if they want to fit in this new narrative.
Right. But then, and you're right about that. But then, if we look at why we are here with this whole scalability, lower fees, modular blockchains, this whole meta, we got here because of DeFi and NFTs, right? So without DeFi and NFTs, before them, nobody really cared about fees as much, really, because it didn't really affect a lot of people because they weren't transacting on the network apart from just sending each other coins. So would you say that the end game then is still DeFi and NFT, and once we resolve all these scalability things, and then ultimately when the dust settles around them, and some chains probably emerge, from this whole crop, then we go back to DeFi and NFT being like the main thing? Is that the end game?
Can I continue, or should Convex?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I think that it's sort of like the Web3 narrative in general. It's not necessarily as in DeFi and NFTs. It's just different primitives that provide utility to users. So once you have more bandwidth, it's like the internet as it was emerging, right? At the beginning, you only had static sites that linked to other static sites. Then you had more powerful servers, more bandwidth, better connections, and so you could have databases which created users and like this, or all of like this user based services, for example, like Facebook and all of these other things. Then eventually you could stream video, so you could have YouTube, you could have Netflix, and a bunch of different things. And so once you allow for a higher or more broad vector space of development, so you could build more different primitives that use more bandwidth on top of blockchains. It liberates sort of like what can be actually done and the utility you could provide to users. And so you could have things like a decentralized social network that actually is viable. It's not like to like a post, it costs you like $3 only to do a like. And so yeah, once you have these things, there's many people experimenting with different use cases which could emerge from blockchains. I think that one of the best teams at this is Newt, which is a branch of Aave that does experimentation, which is led by Zurek's Jim. And so they're doing cool stuff. The Aave is also building, for example, like a social graph protocol, which could then be like the base layer for different social networks. there's many interesting primitives that could emerge. So it's not necessarily that once you have available block space that would come back to DeFi and NFTs. There will certainly still be a lot of demand and traction for those. But for example, you could have like 3D NFTs that are hosted on chain instead of having them off chain, because you have data availability sampling, and you could verify that those 3D models are there. It's not necessarily that they will be the main narratives in the future, when I'm talking about DeFi and NFTs. But yeah, for sure, there's many new things that are going to be relevant, not only those that have been relevant before, I think.
Right, right. That makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would say that there is a fairly high chance that the next wave of apps will not look like this one. Also, because like when we have a thing that works like DeFi, we tend to imagine like an evolution of that where the downsides are removed, and then it kind of stays the same. But usually, the best innovations and the new like trends and stuff like that, they come from amplifying what's strong about a previous trend, and they tend to improve on that. They don't really care about fixing the flaws and all that, but that's fixing the flaws is the first thing we see ahead of us. So it's really hard to say, but I'm fairly confident it won't be the same stuff over and over again. No more food farms.
You got any more predictions?
I want to see a community-owned OpenSea competitor. It's something that's been bothering me for the past year, and it's essentially the fact that I see a centralized entity which is getting like $10 million per day on transaction fees. Well, not transaction fees, but taker fees from their platform. Whenever you sell an NFT, 2.5% of that value goes to OpenSea. And there's no sort of way that a user could ever influence the decisions that are done on OpenSea, or sort of like have a say, or, for example, help build the community or help build OpenSea as an external contributor. So I think that something like SudoSwap, for example, which is emerging, which is built by 0x and a few other people, is one of the potential alternatives to OpenSea. I just think that it's sort of so obvious that there's such a big pie to take from, which is OpenSea, that they have like $3.5 billion in revenue annualized. And when you have such a huge incentive market where you could just tap into that by creating a solution that competes with it, but sort of distributes value back to the community through a token, is sort of something that's got to happen. I don't know who is going to do it, but I think that this year we're finally we'll see this emerge, and maybe on an
Yeah.
L2 as well, because trading NFTs on L1 it's painful.
Yeah. I just saw like yesterday, I think OpenSea raised another 300 million in Series C, I believe,
Yeah.
with participation from Paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I agree. I mean, the OpenSea, I think, in this year is going to come under quite a bit of pressure, and I don't think just necessarily pressure from like within kind of the industry and crypto Twitter, and like I think that's going to spill over also into maybe the more kind of like retail OpenSea user a little bit, because um, I mean, it is painful to use for like the normie, right? Who wants to like trade OpenSea or trade NFTs on OpenSea because of Ethereum gas is expensive, but they don't necessarily know why it's expensive. It just is. So I think that kind of makes OpenSea look bad, anyways. But the everyone's obviously clamoring for them to drop a token, right? Because everyone, I think, feels that they should be getting something back. And I think that might be a rightful argument, like for OpenSea's success, that maybe like the industry as a whole, users, all that stuff should be getting something back. And we saw with the SOS airdrop recently, opinions about that token aside, we saw that there is a sort of fervor around that, right? So what do you guys think OpenSea will drop a token this year? Do you think they will just IPO? I know when there was sort of like a rumored report that went around that they were planning an IPO, but then the OpenSea team sort of like walked that back, and they were like, we wouldn't like IPO without like being open with the community about it, or blah blah blah. What do you think will happen with OpenSea this year?
Well, their Series C gave them an implied valuation of about like $13 billion. So when you have that amount of capital, it's already quite big for a company of or like in a new primitive such as NFTs. Even like talking broadly, when you have companies that are this big, it's going to be certainly interesting what they do with that capital and how they try to exit. Either whether they're going to do an exit to community through launching a token, or an exit to the equity market through an IPO. And well, most people still think, or the people I've talked about still think that they're going to IPO just because it's in their best interest to do so, and not necessarily in the community's interest. Because if you look at users want airdrops, right? Users want to get free money for having used the platform and having given so many fees to OpenSea. Because like if you look at the total revenue, I don't know what it is right now, but it's certainly in the billions of dollars that they've already earned from sort of giving this service of an NFT marketplace. And users want to have shared ownership, and I don't think that the equity market is going to provide that for them. So if they do end up choosing to exit through the equity market and do an IPO, I think that they'll definitely fall out of touch with what Web3 is trying to achieve, and that many of the users that have been on OpenSea are going to try to look for alternatives, and if they don't find them, they will build them themselves. So I think I think it's either you do what the community wants, which is a token, or that's sort of what I've seen the consensus is in the community, or you do the IPO personal gain route.
Yeah, I kind of think the same, but I also think that they won't have enough ETH on themselves in this year to launch a token. I think that they're still pretty comfortable, right, as they are right now, that they're the most dominant player, and they will keep being the most dominant player for a while, at least. I hope not too long, but
Yeah, I'm in total agreement as well. I don't think they will launch a token, at least not early in the year or anytime soon. Maybe like I could see potentially at the fall or something. But to be honest, I don't think they're going to launch a token at all. I think that they will just take the IPO route. And I'm also very excited on decentralized alternatives and very bullish on that this year as good times to get in early on something that almost certainly will emerge, which is OpenSea competition. Any more predictions?
This is sort of like more technical, but multi-domain MEV is sort of emerging fastly in this multi-chain, multi-rollup world. There's many players. So to sum up this narrative, is MEV stands for minor extractable value, but it's being rebranded to maximal extractable value, and it just means that when you're in a blockchain system, there are certain players that have certain rights to order transactions or propose blocks inside of a network, and these proposers are able to sort of extract value by having access to the manipulation of the organization of these blocks. So for example, you could think of, let's say they want to do a trade on Uniswap, and I see that there's a trade with a lot of volume on Uniswap, so like a big trade. What I could do is buy before that person buys and sell right after, and do that within the same block, just because I'm the proposer of the block. So I can manually insert my transaction before and after to sandwich that transaction. So now that MEV servers have become popular on Ethereum and other networks, and people are democratizing it through things like flashbots and other primitives. Now that you have these multiple rollups and like L2s on Ethereum, you have different chains, for example, like Avalanche, that have the same trading pairs that on Ethereum. There's going to emerge a set of trading bots that are trading up these different platforms simultaneously, and they're going to try to reorder blocks or like reorder transactions within blocks at different networks to be able to arbitrage this. So this is sort of like a more niche technical thing that most people want to care about. But I think that that's sort of one of the biggest plays in this year. That's sort of one prediction. I'm also predicting that the merge is going to happen this year. So like proof of stake on Ethereum. It's tentative for like the proof of stake merge is tentatively scheduled for mid 2022. But I think that there's still a few problems that are going to emerge on testnets, so maybe it's going to be pushed back by a few months. But I think it's going to happen this year, like by the end of this year for sure, or like that's my prediction at least.
I'd like to add one thing on top of that. It will happen, and I think it will be underwhelming for most people. I think people have very high expectations of the merge. They think like after the merge, all Ethereum problems will be solved, but that's that's definitely not going to be the case, and people will be disappointed, I think.
Well, the merge just solves a few things, especially in terms of consensus, and it definitely doesn't scale Ethereum. That's sort of like a thing that I want to spread out there as much as I can. Proof of stake does not scale Ethereum. It's just a consensus mechanism to achieve finality. It's not going to have more block space in the network. It's not going to make suddenly like transactions super fast or whatever. It's going to prevent a few things from happening. One is that's going to make Ethereum long-term sustainable instead of having proof of work. So you have sort of like this environmental sustainability, but technical sustainability as well. And there's going to be a good reduction in terms of like the hardware you need to run. So the network is going to be less hardware intensive. So it's going to be more decentralized. And pretty much anyone can partake in providing security to a network by staking their assets, either by manually running a staking validator, which requires 32 ETH, or by using a provider for staking like Rocket Pool or Lido. But yeah, there's many things that are happening on the Ethereum roadmap in terms of Ethereum core. There's like proof of stake, of course, which is one of the most important parts. But there's like this post that was sent by Vitalik that Ethereum sort of has like five different trails, which is following simultaneously. So they're called the merge, the surge, the verge, the purge, and the splurge. And each of them targets a different issue within Ethereum. But I think like the merge is going to be sort of like the most important thing that's happened in Ethereum's history that will allow it to evolve further through these other changes. And for example, people like Vitalik that have been on recently on a podcast with bankless people explaining this. I recommend watching that. But what essentially proof of stake allows Ethereum to do is to sort of implement all of these things that are scheduled. And once these are scheduled, Ethereum is sort of looking to ossify and not move further and just scale with rollups. That's sort of like a prediction that I have this year, that we're finally going to get over this problem that Ethereum has been having since 2015, because like people are asking Ethereum when merge since 2015, because it's sort of it was in the roadmap of Ethereum since inception to get off of proof of work. And so yeah, I think that once you remove this thing and once you see that this is actually possible, it's going to allow, I don't think it's going to be disappointing for users maybe, but in terms of like the fundamentals of the project, once you get sort of like this big step out of the way, it's going to be a good way, it's going to pave a good road for the future evolution of the network.
Right on. I think that we should probably end on that. We've been going about an hour now, which I think is perfect timing. Is there anything else you guys would like to share with the audience or say before we sort of sign off?
Not really, I think. Maybe like Ethereum flipping Bitcoin, but I think that that's going to happen more next year rather than this year. But other than that, I think it's everything that I had in my mind.
Buy my JPEGs.
Buy all of our JPEGs, not financial advice. Cool. Well, thank you, DCbuild3r and Convex Degen, for coming on the show. A bit of housekeeping before we sign off. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that our very own Rick Delaney has written in-depth articles on a bunch of the stuff that we covered here today, including Olympus DAO, including layer ones and layer twos, and where we are today. And I will link those in the description of the YouTube video. If you're watching this on YouTube, you know the drill. Just like, subscribe, ring the notification bell, all that good stuff that every YouTuber tells you to do. Also, please like and do what you got to do on your podcast streaming service of choice. And yeah, until next time, thanks again to DC Builder and Convex Degen for coming on. Their Twitter handles will also be in the description as well as displayed in the video. Thanks to my fellow senior editor Hunain. And until next time.